What if your body hadn't been updated, along with you? Now think about this idea for a second, not as a metaphor, not as cheap philosophy, but as a real possibility, as if at some invisible point in time, something had happened and you simply continued to exist in an earlier version of yourself while the world around you moved on, silently changing, like a system that receives constant updates without notifying you. There's a strange sensation that some people report, difficult to explain in simple words, a kind of slight disconnection, almost imperceptible, as if their own body movements arrive with a slight delay, as if their reflection in the mirror is a little out of sync, not enough to be immediately frightening, but enough to leave a question lingering in the back of their mind. Has it always been like this? Have you ever experienced this? This type of experience is often ignored. The mind tries to rationalize it, saying it's tiredness, distraction, information overload. But what if it was something deeper? What if, behind this feeling of strangeness, there was a more subtle flaw in the way we perceive the fragmented time around us? At times the world seems too normal, and that's what makes everything so strange. People walking, lights turning on, sounds happening exactly as they should. But within all of that, there's a kind of invisible noise, as if reality were being rendered in different layers, and some of them weren't completely synchronized with you. It's as if there's a minimal difference between who you were yesterday and who your body believes you still are today. And it starts small, a gesture you feel you've done before, but you don't know when. An automatic reaction that seems to come from an older you, a moment when everything seems to work on autopilot, but with a slight sense of delay, as if the mind has to wait for the body to catch up to the present. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, because what's most disturbing isn't when the body obviously fails, but when it continues to function normally, while something inside you begins to realize that there's an invisible difference between being alive and being completely in sync with existence itself. And the more you try to ignore that feeling, the more it seems to repeat itself in small fragments of the day. In reflections, in strange pauses, in thought, in moments when everything seems slightly out of place, as if reality were updating, except you. What if this isn't just my impression? What if, on some level we haven't yet been able to comprehend, there really is a kind of mismatch between versions of ourselves, as if the body was stuck in an old update while the world has already moved on to several versions ahead? This idea starts to become difficult to ignore when you realize you're not alone in it. Small accounts, strange coincidences, patterns that repeat themselves in different places, always describing the same feeling, that of being present, but not fully aligned with the present. At this point, the question ceases to be simply, is this real? And becomes something much more uncomfortable. What exactly is outdated about you, and why? And it is precisely at this point that things start to get more unsettling, because when you try to fit these experiences into common explanations, something simply doesn't quite fit. It's as if the explanation is always one step behind the feeling. And the more you try to rationalize, the more that little feeling of discrepancy seems to repeat itself at other times of the day, as if it were waiting for you to pay attention to it again. And if this makes sense to you in some way, maybe it's not just a passing curiosity. Maybe it's exactly the kind of perception that many people ignore because they don't know how to name it. And if you've ever felt something similar, even mildly, comment below what has caught your attention the most so far. It could be a feeling, a question, or even a strange experience that you've never been able to explain properly. Sometimes, it's precisely in the exchange of experiences that we realize we're not as isolated in this perception as it seems. If this type of content captivates you, makes you think, or leaves you with that feeling of there's something here I hadn't considered before, then please give it a like. This helps this video reach more people who may be going through the same reflections without even realizing it. And more than that, it shows that this type of narrative, more mysterious and psychological, has room to grow and continue to be explored here. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Not only to follow what comes next in this story, but because this channel exists precisely to explore these boundaries between perception, reality, and that which always seems out of sync. And each new subscription helps keep this type of content alive, ensuring that more stories like this continue to be produced and reach you. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, creating a kind of community of people who are also interested in these strange ideas. Almost impossible to prove, but difficult to ignore once you start to notice them. And while you're thinking about this, there's an important detail that hasn't been fully explained yet. Something that seems to be behind this feeling of being out of touch, as if there were an even deeper layer to this phenomenon that few can truly perceive. And it is precisely at this point that perception begins to change almost imperceptibly, as if something within your daily experience were being subtly rewritten without you realizing the exact moment it happens. Because when we talk about a body that is not up to date, we are not just talking about an isolated sensation, but about a possible mismatch between different layers of reality that overlap all the time, creating small flaws in the way you interpret the present. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is at this level that the first clearest sign emerges that this is not just imagination or mental coincidence. In some accounts, this disruption does not appear as something continuous, but as brief interruptions, almost like cuts in the natural flow of reality. Small moments in which everything seems to simply fail. Sound disappears for a fraction of a second. The movement of the environment seems to freeze, or the very sensation of presence changes without warning. And the strangest thing is that this isn't perceived as something explosive or obvious. It's subtle, almost like a rendering error in perception itself. A second in which the world doesn't respond as it should, and then everything returns to normal, as if nothing had happened. But the mind registers it. Even if in a confused way, there's an impact. A slight mark that remains there, like a doubt that doesn't find an immediate explanation. This type of experience begins to alter how you interpret time itself, because when these glitches appear, even if rarely, they raise an uncomfortable question. Is time truly continuous, or just a sequence of updates that aren't always processed perfectly? And what if these small glitches are just the first level of something much deeper, related to how reality organizes itself behind the scenes of perception? In some cases, these interruptions seem to be accompanied by a strange feeling of displacement, as if for a moment you weren't exactly synchronized with your surroundings. It's not easy to explain, because there's no concrete proof, only the direct experience of something that doesn't quite fit into the common logic of routine. And that's precisely what makes it all the more impactful. It's not what happened, but the fact that it happens and is then erased, as if it never existed. Over time, this type of perception begins to influence decisions, thoughts, and even the way you observe the details of daily life. Small changes in mindset emerge almost imperceptibly, as if your consciousness were trying to understand a hidden pattern behind these flaws. And the more you observe, the more it seems that there is something in the background of reality trying to remain consistent. But it doesn't always succeed. Now, the most intriguing question is that these moments don't seem random to everyone. Some describe patterns, repetitions, as if these glitches were connected to something larger, a kind of structure that we still can't fully understand. And this raises an even deeper possibility about the impact of these glitches on how our own journey of perception is being constructed, as if we were only accessing fragments of a much larger reality that we still can't fully see. And this opens up space for something even stranger that begins to emerge when these moments cease to be rare and start to follow a pattern that is almost impossible to ignore. Comment below. This makes sense to me. And when these small glitches start to repeat themselves, something changes in the way you observe the world around you. It's no longer just about an isolated instant of timing failure, but about the possibility that there's an invisible pattern operating behind it all, something that regulates these interruptions as if they were part of a larger system, still beyond the reach of ordinary perception. And this begins to affect how you interpret every detail of your routine, as if any small delay, any strange silence, or any feeling of being out of sync could be a fragment of something much larger trying to reveal itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the idea arises that these events are not random, but follow a hidden logic, almost as if reality were constantly trying to correct itself, but couldn't always maintain perfect stability. At times, these patterns begin to align in a disturbing way, as if there were a sequence behind the flaws, a kind of invisible signature present in each distortion of time. And the more you pay attention, the harder it becomes to ignore the feeling that there is a structure behind what seemed like mere chance. This type of perception completely changes the mindset of those who begin to notice these signs. Reality ceases to be something solid and predictable and begins to seem like a dynamic system, full of constant adjustments happening behind the scenes. Small everyday decisions take on a new weight, as if each choice were connected to a chain of events that can directly influence these imbalances. And it is at this point that the journey of perception begins to deepen, because it is no longer just about observing flaws, but about understanding the impact they can have on how you position yourself within your own existence. And as these patterns become more evident, an even more uncomfortable question arises. If there is a pattern, then there must also be an origin. Something is generating these inconsistencies, even if silently. And this opens the door to a hidden truth that begins to insinuate itself gradually, as if it had always been there, but only now are its edges becoming noticeable. Small fragments of repetition, coincidences that seem to connect, and a growing feeling that reality is not as continuous as it appears to be. This type of perception also has a direct impact on how you interpret your own journey, because when you start to see patterns where before there was only chaos, everything changes. Experiences cease to be isolated and become part of a larger flow, as if each moment were a reflection of something that is constantly being adjusted behind the scenes of existence. And this inevitably leads to a new form of observation, more attentive, more sensitive. Almost as if you were deciphering a code that was never meant to be perceived so easily. And the more this idea develops, the more evident it becomes that these patterns may be connected to the first sign you didn't even notice when it happened. That instant when everything simply failed for a second, and reality seemed to hesitate before continuing. And it is precisely from there that something even deeper begins to form. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Write this down. I'm on this journey to, and when this idea of invisible patterns begins to solidify, something even deeper emerges in perception. The possibility that it is not just time that is failing at certain moments, but something directly related to how existence itself is carried within us. as if reality were not continuous, but composed of versions, and each one of them required constant updating for everything to remain aligned. And that's where a strange, almost uncomfortable concept comes in, but one that begins to make sense within this logic. Outdated bodies. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when we talk about outdated bodies, we're not talking about something physical in the traditional sense, but about a disconnect between the version of reality you occupy and the most current version of the system around you. It's as if, at certain times, you continue operating in an earlier layer of reality while everything around you has already advanced to another version, creating small perceptual misalignments that manifest as these glitches, these subtle flaws in time and experience. And this completely changes how you interpret these events. What previously seemed like just a delay, a strange feeling, or a distorted déjà vu, begins to be seen as possible evidence of a larger mismatch, a kind of silent impact on your own journey of consciousness, as if each person were constantly being adjusted to new versions of reality, but not everyone was synchronized to the same rhythm. And this raises an even deeper question about decisions, transformation, and even what we call identity. Because if you're in an older version of yourself while the world has already moved forward, it means that part of your perception may be anchored in information that no longer fully applies to the present. And this mismatch isn't perceived directly. It appears as small inconsistencies, memories that don't fit perfectly, reactions that seem too automatic, or even moments when the surrounding reality seems to respond with a slight delay to your presence. This type of understanding creates an interesting psychological impact because you begin to see life as a constantly updating system, where each instant can represent an invisible transition between versions of reality. And the more attention you pay to this, the more you realize that these delays are not random, but perhaps part of a deeper logic that we are not yet able to fully comprehend. And it is at this point that the idea of hidden truth begins to strengthen, as if there were a mechanism behind the scenes continuously adjusting everything we perceive, while certain elements remain temporarily out of sync. And this not only alters how you observe the world, but also influences your mindset, your perception of impact, and even how you interpret your own existence within this flow. And as this notion expands, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that these outdated bodies are not an exception, but part of something much larger, a continuous process of alignment between versions of reality that we still cannot fully see. And it is precisely from this deeper layer that something even more unsettling begins to emerge, linked to the risk of system correction. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below, this makes sense to me. And when this idea of outdated bodies begins to fit with other experiences, an even stranger effect emerges in perception. The feeling that not all the memories you carry belong exactly to the moment you are living now. As if some memories were displaced in time, fitted into an earlier version of reality, but still accessible as loose fragments within your consciousness. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is the point where the line between experience and interpretation starts to become extremely thin. In some accounts and internal perceptions, these memories don't follow a linear logic. They arise at random moments, triggered by simple everyday events, but carry a strangeness that's hard to ignore. It's not just a common déjà vu, it's something more intense, as if you were remembering an alternative version of decisions, paths, and even small situations that never fully solidified in the present. And this begins to directly impact your mindset, because when you realize that some memories don't seem to fit perfectly into the timeline you believe you're living in, an inevitable doubt arises about the structure of reality itself. What if the journey isn't as linear as it seems? What if there are overlapping layers of experiences, where each decision creates small branches that still leave perceptible traces even after being erased from the current version? This type of reflection has a profound impact on how you interpret your own identity, because you begin to question whether what you remember is truly part of your present, or just echoes of past versions that haven't yet been fully synchronized with the now. And this misalignment generates a curious feeling, almost as if there's a subtle gap between what you've lived and what you should be living at this very moment. And the more you observe this, the more you notice small details that previously went unnoticed. An object that seems out of place, a conversation that sounds slightly different than you expected, or even a feeling of familiarity with something that, rationally, you know is new. These fragments begin to accumulate as clues to a more complex system, suggesting that reality may be constantly rearranging the information that makes up your experience. From this perspective, the idea of hidden truth gains a new layer, because it's not just about external events, but about how your own perception might be adjusted over time. It's as if each update to reality brings small corrections to how you remember, feel, and interpret everything around you. And this creates a direct impact on how you view decisions, choices, and even the continuation of your own journey. And as this structure begins to reveal itself more clearly, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that these displaced memories are not isolated errors, but part of a larger process of alignment between versions of existence that are still in transition. And it is precisely at this point that something even more disturbing arises regarding the impact of this on the world around us. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. And when these memories begin to blend with the perception of the present, something even stranger happens. The world around you seems to react slightly differently to your presence. Not explicitly or dramatically, but in small, almost imperceptible details, as if there were a subtle delay in how everything responds to you. A conversation that seems to lose its rhythm for a second, a glance that doesn't quite land where it should, or an everyday situation that feels slightly out of alignment. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the idea of synchronicity begins to break down more clearly within perception. It's not just about what you remember or feel internally, but about how the external environment seems, at certain moments, not to exactly match your presence, as if there were a small gap between your action and the world's reaction, creating a strange feeling of displacement within reality itself. And this begins to directly impact your mindset and how you interpret each interaction. Small gestures from the people around you start to be observed more closely, as if every detail could carry a clue that something is not completely synchronized. And even if rationally everything seems normal, there is an underlying perception that insists on noticing these small flaws, these micro discrepancies that previously went unnoticed. This type of experience creates an interesting psychological impact because you begin to feel as if you are operating at a slightly different frequency from the environment. Not enough to be evident, but enough to generate a constant feeling of strangeness. And the more this is repeated, the more the idea of hidden truth begins to gain strength, as if there were a system constantly adjusting how reality responds to your actions. And within this journey of perception, each daily decision takes on a different weight, not because the situations have objectively changed, but because the way you perceive them has changed. Everything begins to seem like part of a larger backdrop, where small inconsistencies can be signs of something that hasn't yet been fully understood. And this profoundly alters how you relate to the impact of the world around you, as if each moment could contain a small flaw in the continuity of experience. And the more this feeling intensifies, the harder it becomes to separate what is merely interpretation from what might be a real pattern slowly emerging from the repetition of these events. As if reality were trying to remain stable but couldn't always keep up with all the layers of perception at the same time. And it is precisely at this point that something even more unsettling begins to emerge, when this lack of synchronicity ceases to be subtle and begins to manifest itself in an almost repetitive way. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below, this makes sense to me. And when this feeling of lack of synchronicity begins to repeat itself more frequently, something unexpected happens within this perception. The impression that you are not the only one who is out of alignment, as if, amidst these small flaws in reality, there were other people who also seemed to carry the same kind of discord, almost as if they were echoes of the same phenomenon manifesting in different consciousnesses at the same time. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is at this point that the most disconcerting idea of all arises: the possibility that other human glitches exist. People who, like you, begin to perceive small inconsistencies in the flow of time, in the response of the environment, or even in the way reality seems to adjust itself slightly imperfectly around them. It's not something obvious, it's not something that is directly confirmed, but rather a feeling shared in subtle moments, almost as if there were a silent recognition between two perceptions that shouldn't be connected. And this completely changes how you interpret everyday encounters. A glance that lasts a little longer than usual, an awkward pause in a conversation, or even the feeling that someone seems to understand something that wasn't said aloud. These details begin to take on a new meaning within this journey of perception, as if they were small clues that reality is not only failing individually, but perhaps becoming collectively out of sync at certain points. And this creates a profound impact on mindset, because you begin to consider the possibility that you are not isolated in this experience, that perhaps there are other points of consciousness perceiving the same imbalances, even if in different ways. And this idea, in itself, already alters how you position yourself within the world, because it transforms an internal perception into something that may be reflected externally in other people. This type of revelation changes the way you observe simple, everyday interactions. Each encounter takes on an extra layer of meaning, as if there were a silent recognition of something that hasn't been fully explained yet. And within this context, the idea of hidden truth expands again, now not just as something individual, but as a possible shared pattern among different human experiences. And the more you consider this possibility, the more complex the behind-the-scenes reality seems, almost as if there are different levels of synchronization happening at the same time, not all perfectly aligned. And this raises an even deeper question about impact and transformation, because if there are other outsiders within the system, then perhaps there is a much larger dynamic happening behind these seemingly random encounters. And it is precisely at this point that something even more unsettling begins to emerge, when these recognitions cease to be mere sensations and start to seem part of a larger structure, as if reality were subtly orchestrating these encounters. And this opens the way to an even deeper layer of this phenomenon that begins to reveal itself little by little. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. And when these encounters begin to seem less random and more recurrent in your perception, an almost inevitable need arises to understand what is really behind it all. Because it's no longer just about isolated sensations, glitches, or small flaws in the synchronicity of daily life. Now there's the impression that there's a larger structure supporting these experiences, something that organizes these moments invisibly, as if the very flow of reality were being adjusted in layers that we cannot yet fully see. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the idea of broken time begins to take on a new form within this narrative. Not as something literal or physical in the traditional sense, but as a perception that time may not be as continuous as it seems. Instead of a straight line, it may be closer to a fragmented system, where different instants coexist in slightly misaligned states, creating those small distortions that we perceive as glitches, delays, or strange repetitions. And this completely changes how you interpret each experience. What once seemed like mere coincidence begins to be seen as possible evidence of a more complex system, where reality constantly adjusts to maintain a kind of overall stability. But this adjustment isn't always perfect, and it's in these moments of imperfection that the strangest effects arise: displaced memories, out-of-order perceptions, encounters that seem to have been staged in a slightly incorrect way. This type of understanding has a profound impact on mindset because it causes each moment to be seen as part of a larger process of constructing reality. And within this journey of perception, a new way of interpreting impact and personal transformation emerges, not as linear changes, but as shifts between possible versions of one's own existence, where each choice can represent a small change of alignment within this larger system. And the more this idea develops, the more relevant the notion of the behind-the-scenes aspects of reality becomes, because if time truly functions in a fragmented or adjustable way, then what we perceive as the present may only be a temporary version of something that is constantly being reconfigured. And this opens up space for an even deeper hidden truth, where the very continuity of human experience may be constructed in overlapping layers without us directly perceiving it. Within this context, glitches cease to be merely isolated failures and begin to be interpreted as small leaks in this larger structure, as if for a few seconds it were possible to perceive the stitching between different versions of reality. And this not only alters how you observe the world, but also influences how you understand your own presence within it, as if each instant carried an invisible potential for reorganization. And it is precisely at this point that an even deeper layer of this perception emerges, when the idea of broken time begins to connect with something even more unsettling, something that seems to be directly linked to how these transitions happen without warning. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." And when this perception of fragmented time solidifies, an even more unsettling consequence emerges within this logic: the feeling that, if there is a system adjusting reality in different layers, then there is also a correction mechanism constantly working to keep everything within an acceptable standard. And this completely changes how these glitches cease to be mere curiosities, and begin to be seen as possible signs of instability within this larger structure. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the idea of the risk of being corrected by the system comes in. Not as something literal or physical in the traditional sense, but as a metaphor for this constant readjustment process that seems to happen when something deviates too much from the expected synchronicity. As if, by perceiving these flaws more clearly, you begin to approach an invisible boundary between what is normally perceived and what needs to be realigned so that the continuity of the experience is not broken. And this creates a profound impact on mindset because it completely changes how you interpret signs, coincidences, and even small inconsistencies in daily life. Everything takes on a different weight, as if every detail could be an indication that something is trying to restore balance. And within this journey of perception, a silent tension arises between observing too much and simply going along without noticing, as if existing in two different states of consciousness could generate completely different results in how reality responds. And it is at this point that the idea of hidden truth intensifies, because it begins to seem that the system not only adjusts the world around you, but also reacts to how you perceive it. The more attention you give to these patterns, the more they seem to reorganize themselves, as if there were a kind of feedback loop between observer and structure. And this opens up space for an even deeper reflection on impact and decision, since each level of perception may be influencing the very level of stability of the experience. And the more this logic develops, the more the inner workings of reality seem active, almost alive, adjusting small details to avoid major disruptions. Within this scenario, glitches cease to be merely random failures and begin to be interpreted as moments of tension between versions of reality trying to maintain coherence with each other, as if something were constantly correcting deviations before they become too noticeable. And this inevitably leads to a subtle sense of vigilance, not in an external sense, but internally, as if the simple act of perceiving could alter the state of what is being observed. And within this dynamic, an even more delicate question arises about transformation. To what extent can awareness of a pattern accelerate or interrupt this correction process? And what happens when someone starts noticing too much what should remain imperceptible within this structure? And it is precisely at this point that something even deeper begins to form. When this feeling of correction ceases to be merely theoretical and begins to connect directly with the first signs that started it all. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. And when this idea of correction begins to approach the first signs that gave rise to all this perception, an even more delicate point emerges within this logic. The feeling that there is a limit between remaining as you are now or being adjusted to a new version of reality. And this doesn't appear directly or dramatically, but as a silent tension within the very way you perceive time, memories, and even the continuity of your existence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the final dilemma within this narrative arises. To accept the update or to disappear within the very incoherence of perception, not as a literal choice but as a representation of this idea that every structure in motion needs to maintain some kind of balance to continue existing stably. And when something deviates too much from this balance, the dynamic itself seems to seek ways of readjustment, whether through subtle adjustments in experience or changes in how everything is interpreted internally. And this creates a very strong impact on mindset, because it begins to raise a question that shakes the very foundation of identity. What does it mean to remain the same within a system that is constantly updating itself? And to what extent is what you consider me truly continuous, or just a sequence of slightly adjusted versions over time? Within this journey of perception, each thought, each memory, and each sensation begins to carry a new weight, as if everything were embedded in a larger, invisible process of transformation. And it is at this point that the idea of hidden truth deepens even further, because it is not just about flaws in reality or isolated glitches, but about a possible mechanism of continuous adaptation, where stability depends precisely on these constant corrections. And the more you observe this, the more you realize that the impact is not only in the external environment, but also in the way your own consciousness interprets the flow of experience. Within this scenario, the notion of the behind-the-scenes reality becomes almost inevitable, as if there were a silent system reorganizing everything in real time to prevent any fragment from becoming completely disconnected from the rest. And this causes each small inconsistency to take on a new meaning, not as an error, but as part of a larger process of alignment between different possible states of existence. And the more this structure reveals itself in perception, the harder it becomes to ignore the feeling that these moments of maladjustment, these strange encounters, and these displaced memories may all be connected to the same origin, not yet fully understood. And it is precisely at this point that something even deeper begins to approach. When the idea of updating ceases to be just a concept and begins to directly touch the very limit of consciousness. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Comment below. This makes sense to me, and if you've made it this far, this kind of perception probably hasn't escaped your notice. On some level, these ideas of broken time, glitches in reality, and even this feeling of disarray may have resonated differently than a simple ordinary story. And that already says a lot about how you perceive this type of content. If this video made you think, question, or even observe the world in a slightly more attentive way, it's worth subscribing to the channel. Not as an automatic thing to do, but because the idea here is precisely to continue exploring this type of reflection, where reality, perception, and these small behind-the-scenes aspects of experience blend together in a deeper way. And if you made it to the end, comment below, this message was for me. This helps us understand who truly followed this journey to the end, and creates a connection between those watching and what's being built here. If at any point you felt a connection to the story, please like the video, not only as support but as a way to signal that this type of narrative has a place and continuity here. And now, if this idea of fragmented reality, out-of-sync updates and perceptions caught your attention, there's another video right here that delves even deeper into this line of thought in an even more intense way. Click and continue reading there.